So we're here to solve the Statue Park puzzle by Ashish Kumar. Its theme is love stand. You can see this large heart at the top. And hopefully one of the first things you noticed was that there are some pretty long extended black walls, that most of the heart shape is made out of black, which means that this corner cell has to keep coming out. But even as you get to the center of the grid, these white cells are going to have to keep coming out into these spaces. If we don't use all the ones I've marked, we're going to constrain part of the grid and keep the rest from connecting. One thing that will quickly hopefully show you is that you have some constraints, like for instance, this cell looks like the efficient way is to make a W. You can probably quickly mentally show that putting in the Z, which isolates cells, is no good. And so it looks like the star of this puzzle is marking this W shape. This single cell will connect to these three, but it can't take this cell, which would be another W. We get a Z. So the first two pentominoes in the grid are the W and the Z. And marking those in, we now are going to have this top pentomino is going to take these three cells. It can come out as far as to this one, but it can be a Y, it can be a P, it can be an F. Those look to be the only shapes for it. One thing I note for sure is that these two cells here must connect to this one. Let's say that they didn't. Then they would come over like this, but they would isolate the grid. And so it looks like one thing that we're going to do in this puzzle is work down these diagonals with some counts. And the way this goes is if you see that you have these two and this third cell, this will be a fourth. Either of these in blue is a fourth. And that means you can't take either of these because you'd end up adding another in. And so, for instance, this is 6 cells. This would be 6 cells. And so what you know for sure is that off this diagonal, once now we have an effective count of 4 for this group with an either or choice here, you can't get all the way down to this cell. Now look that these two are connecting, so they'll form a group of size 3, and that group of size 3 can't connect to this group of size 2 because it would end up forming a group of size 6. We've got another black wall here, which I'll just mark now because it looks like that's the way I'm going to keep coming up this diagonal. So I have these two connecting to this cell, which will make a size 4. And that means that I can't keep going to these cells or I'd get too large. And that means that these two clues will connect to each other and not to anything else. In order for these two to not isolate the grid, so coming all the way over here would be a problem, we have to at least leave this one cell open. Got to take this cell, which means I can take this one down. And I think now what looks to be important is to actually track what shapes can these pentominoes be. We've got some pretty similar patterns, like this pattern here and this pattern here are actually identical. And you may not notice that, but one shape it can make is a Y, another shape it can make is a P, and the last shape it can make is an F. So I'll just mark those in here. And if I come up to this shape, this is, again, the same shape in terms of the white cells around it, but you can make a Y, you can make a P, you can make an F. And so those don't seem to be too powerful until you actually come over here and see that this shape is going to be a Y or it's going to be a P. And so the first important deduction in this puzzle, after you get some of this connectivity through the black walls, is to see that the Y, the P, and the F pentomino are effectively placed in the spots I've marked, and no other pentomino can be Y, P, or F. That's going to be really key, I think, starting right up here and even up here, that there are a set of shapes it can't be. So let's take like this shape. One thing we know is we'll always use this cell, because if it didn't use this cell, we'd run out of space quite quickly. But once it uses this cell, it can't take this because that would form another P, and somewhere in these three pentominoes is the P already. So this has to look like this, and it also isn't going to be a Y. It's not going to come straight across. It's not going to be an F, so it's not going to do this. There's only one other pentomino shape this can be, which is the X. And so it's actually interesting in this puzzle we place the X sooner. Often the X is placed towards the end of the solve, but the unique shape when Y, P, and F are removed is for this to be an X. You are going to have a similar constraint. You could have done this sooner on this one on the edge. And one thing to see is it's never going to take all the way out to this cell. If it took this cell, it forms an F, so that cell is no good. So now it's got to be in a 2x3 box. A 2x3 box is a P or a U, but the P is in the grid, so this must be a U. That puts this in, so we've got the U and the P. sorry, the U and the Y now in the grid. This now must be a P, and that means this must be an F. And with that in the grid, this in the grid, it looks like we've placed most of the top, and we're getting into the sides here. And so let's now come back to some of the stuff we were doing before. And maybe the same way we had this diagonal flow, there's going to be something working up over here. And I think it's going to start by seeing what shapes are left. And I guess one of the first things when I see this remaining inventory that looks pretty key is this I pentomino. We now don't have so much in the grid that can take 5 in a row. One spot looks to be right here, but notice that will isolate the grid, so that's not a valid I. There's nothing horizontal in these rows that's going to work. You know, spaces like this will just connect to other cells. So this bottom row looks fine. As we look vertically, none of these are valid options. And so the bottom row is the space for the I. It's got to take these cells, it looks like for sure, and it can't be further to the left. And in doing that, we can mark some more off like this and effectively say we have the I in the grid. We don't know exactly where it goes. It's got 2 options still, but it's one of those. That now means that we have a V, a T, an L, and an N to place, and we could start with a cell like this and say which shape can that be a part of. Well, it can either dodge the pentomino that's just below it, and that's going to cause issues because while it can form a T, it's going to isolate cells, or it can join the pentomino below it, and it looks like for sure it's going to take one of these 2 cells. And if it took this cell, we don't have a shape that's valid for it. The W, the F, and the P are all in the grid. So the only shape that really works for this uses this cell, and then you'll see it extends out. It is the V, and for sure that's what goes there. This shape needs to be an L, an N, or a T. It can't be a T with the cell coming here, but it can be an N or it can be an L. It'll always take these cells. We need to still figure now where the T or the is essentially the remaining piece goes. So let's just start with this cell. Can this be part of a T? If it's part of a T, it would have to have a vertical section here like this. That would not work because it touches another shape. If it were this vertical, it would now connect over to this. So actually, after we've marked these pieces in the grid, this is not a T, so this is another L or N. We actually don't know which of those, which means that the T is going to have to be this pentomino here. So let's just say that that connects. That forces this, that forces this. That's the only T that works in that part of the grid. Marking this in puts in a forced L. We have to come through this channel. The remaining pentomino is the N, and you'll see that there's only one option for that, which is the end of the puzzle. So I hope you got through this really impressive construction as smoothly as we did in this video. It seemed it had really 3 kinds of deductions to think through. The first were some constraints and keeping whites connected. That gave us some interesting logic along these diagonals, logic that would eventually come back up at the end of the puzzle. But really it was the shape inventory and seeing that we had 3 pentomino placements that were fairly similar, 2 that were identical with a YPF choice, and this one up here that was a Y or a P, and collectively they assigned where the YPF were in the grid. And that gave us limits on the far right, which eventually forced these shapes, and then gave us a narrow set of pentominoes to place at the very bottom to finish the puzzle. So hope you learned a little bit about Statue Park and how to solve this challenging one from Ashish Kumar, and we'll see you again soon.